It is 7 o'clock on the 20th of October 1938. You are listening to the BBC National Programme. It is time for this week's Question Time.
Good evening and welcome to a special edition of Question Time. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in Southampton Guildhall tonight. Tonight are Shiela Grant-Duff, an eminent freelance journalist, Lord Halifax, Foreign Secretary and former Viceroy of India, with Charles Madge from Mass Observation. Tonight we are discussing the British opinion of recent events in Czechoslovakia. When Chamberlain returned from Munich, he claimed peace for our time, but was the price too great? Let's have our first question from Matthew Beadle.
Was Mr. Chamberlain right to give Hitler the Sudetenland?
Was Chamberlain right to give Hitler the Sudetenland? Lord Halifax, what do you have to say about that?
Absolutely. We must remember that Chamberlain has saved us from another European war. Czechoslovakia owes its existence to the decisions made at Versailles after the Great War. We did not consider the Sudeten Germans at that time, and now we have addressed their grievances. Let us not forget that these people did not want to be part of Czechoslovakia, and that their opinion has to be taken into account. The loss of the Sudetenland was not the more desirable outcome for President Beneš and the Czechs, but it is a small price to pay for peace. In the long term, this will prove the best outcome for everyone involved. How can anybody believe that this peaceful settlement between the Czechs and the Sudeten Germans was anything but the right thing to do?
Miss Grant-Duff, how do you respond to this?
Lord Halifax would have us all believe that because the Sudeten Germans, a small minority it should be noted, are content to no longer be part of Czechoslovakia, Britain's actions regarding the recent crisis have been honourable. He could not be more wrong. We have shamefully betrayed the Czech people. If the British government has all along had the intention to further Nazi aims in Central Europe, it could hardly have reached a conclusion more satisfactory to the Nazis. Within 6 months of their victory of May the 21st, the democratic powers appeared to have surrendered their position along with their principles. And to address Lord Halifax's final point, from my experience, I believe there are a great many members of the British public who feel ashamed of our country's failure to support Czechoslovakia in its hour of need.
Ashamed of our country? Mr. Madge?
Well, to be honest, I believe it's more important to assess what the public thinks rather than my opinion. Over the last year or so, I've been heavily involved in creating an organisation called Mass Observation, an anthropology of all aspects of British life. We want to show the politicians whether or not their actions really do resonate with the British people's feelings, and hopefully our organisation will help them make better decisions in the future. In fact, this whole Czechoslovakia debacle has proved to be a polarising topic because men and women seem to have very different feelings. I'm sure there'll be many men in this audience tonight disappointed with Chamberlain, because actually we found that over 2 days last month, 67% of males were indignant with the proposed handover of the Sudetenland. However, 35% of women said they simply didn't know what to do about the situation, whilst amongst males it was half that figure. I must say though, it is clear that most men and women are not supporting our Prime Minister, with only a meagre 22% being pro-Chamberlain at the end of September this year, and an astounding 90% being pro-war.
Very well. Thank you, Mr. Madge. Now let's turn to our audience. The woman in spectacles near the back.
Well, yes, I in fact agree with Lord Halifax. I'm quite honestly relieved about the entire situation. Though the terms might be deemed unfair on the Czechs, this was the only way that we, as a country, could avoid war with Hitler, something that I most certainly do not wish to occur, and I'm almost positive that the remaining British public would not want this for their country either.
The man in the spotty bow tie, please.
I disagree with what the previous lady has just said. We can't just think about ourselves here. I personally feel very ashamed about how we've treated the Czech people. We repeatedly allowed Hitler to get away with breaking an international treaty. First we let him annex Austria, and now we've let him take away the hugely strategic Czech frontier. If Hitler decided to take what's left of Czechoslovakia, I doubt we'll honour the Munich Agreement and go to war to defend it. But my point is, how can we ignore the plight of a people whom we've repeatedly betrayed?
How can we ignore the plight of people whom we've repeatedly betrayed? Lord Halifax.
We have not betrayed the Czechs. Quite to the contrary, in fact, we've ensured a peaceful resolution in Central Europe. Indeed, if one was to look at the Sudeten Germans, you could see that they are happy to be part of the Reich. So in that respect, we have removed the potential threat of a future conflict. Furthermore, the British Empire has been kept out of a war, a fact that has no doubt brought relief to millions of families inside our great nation. As I said earlier, it is plain to see that the Munich Agreement has benefited every party involved.
Yes. The man in bow tie again, please.
How can you say that every party has benefited? Yes, perhaps the Czechs neglected the rights of the German minorities, but they're the ones who have been treated badly by friend and foe. Even now, thousands of Czechs are fleeing from their homes in the Sudetenland. How can this be just or fair? What gives Britain the right to give away what's not hers?
May I respond?
Please do.
The gentleman is absolutely right. It was exactly the point I was trying to make earlier. We have betrayed a nation, when instead we should have defended them. Hitler has remilitarized the Rhineland, he's annexed Austria, and now we've given him the Sudetenland on a plate. Versailles has quite clearly been defied, time and time again, and we have done little more than to sit by, watch it happen, and pretend to celebrate afterwards. One has to wonder, when will this stop? Which unfortunate country will be next?
Miss Grant-Duff, you have completely misunderstood the situation. The very purpose of Versailles was to ensure that there was a lasting peace in Europe after the Great War. The Prime Minister has negotiated refined terms to ensure that this peace continues. An act that should be commended, not condemned. Hitler has given his word to the Prime Minister that he has no more territorial ambitions in Europe. In addition, not only have the four powers signed the Munich settlement, but our nation has agreed to an Anglo-German Memorandum of Understanding. These agreements mean that once again we can be sure that peace will remain triumphant in Europe, a fact that will keep Britain and the British people out of war.
Well, actually...
Miss Grant-Duff, you've made your point. Thank you, Lord Halifax. Let's go back to our audience. Yes, you in the fluffy green cardigan, please.
I wholeheartedly believe that Chamberlain was right to give away the Sudetenland. Personally, I believe the Czechs were in a measure guilty of neglect to provide expression for the German minorities. The only alternative was war, and we most certainly were not and still aren't ready for that.
The young lady in the front row, please.
To be honest, I think it's up to the people in power to decide the best way forward, and we should just leave them to get on with it. I don't really like to concern myself with those affairs. Anyway, it's a crisis every day if you believe everything you read in the papers. There's always something to be worrying about, and I'm just sick of it. If Hitler wants a war, well, he'll have one. Then we'll have a war whether we want it or not. We, the public, can't control what Hitler will do, or even Chamberlain for that matter, so what's the use in getting so worked up about it? We should just leave it to the experts. Hitler will do what he wants anyway.
This lady believes that Hitler will do what he wants regardless. This is quite a strong view. Charles, Madge, is this the kind of opinion you've come across in your studies?
Well, it's difficult to say. The press would certainly have you believe that the public stand 100% behind our Prime Minister, but the figures I mentioned earlier clearly show that that just isn't true. I'm a little fearful that what I'm about to say will probably be cut from the transmission. But anyway, on the 27th of September this year, Chamberlain claimed he'd received many letters of support, but I believe the Prime Minister was confident in such claims because he knows the BBC, the very station we are broadcasting from, helped to suppress negative opinion. He suggested that all these letters were praising him. However, one observer we questioned noted that in one provincial town, 800 letters protesting Chamberlain were sent to 10 Downing Street.
What a ridiculous thing to say.
1 minute, Lord Halifax. I am sure that Shiela Grant-Duff would have something to say to that.
Mr. Madge raises some important points about the media. In fact, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the public aren't already thinking similar things about the news they receive themselves. The level of government intervention in terms of what can and can't be published is quite astonishing, really. I used to work for the Observer, so I've experienced this firsthand. One example that springs to mind, if we cast our minds back to Lord Runciman's mission to mediate between the Czech government and the Sudeten Germans, was the gross exaggeration of this in the press. I mean, my former boss and the editor of the Observer, Mr. Garvin, referred to it as a pilgrimage of peace. But then, that's not surprising given the closeness of his relationship with the Prime Minister.
We will take one more comment from the audience, and then we will hear from Lord Halifax. The woman in the flowery dress, please.
In all honesty, it makes no difference to me whether the press present it in a positive or a negative way. I just don't want to hear any more about the crisis. In fact, my interest is decreasing so much so that I actually dislike listening to the news now. It's a shame, really, because there was a time when I hated to miss the news. I take little interest in any accounts of the crisis, which seem to be everywhere. I'm just getting sick and tired of people going on and on about wars, and if people start talking about another war, I feel like saying, for goodness sake, shut up. We shouldn't try to second-guess what may or may not happen, just causes unnecessary panic. And how can we even form an opinion when, as Miss Grant-Duff has just pointed out, you can't believe all you see in the papers? While the papers constantly contradict each other, I do think the wireless is generally accurate. But saying that, if the government can manipulate the press, what's to say they can't do the same with the BBC? I just don't know what to trust anymore.
Lord Halifax?
I am sorry you feel that way, but I can assure you that the news presented in the British press is not manipulated by the government. This is not Stalin's Russia. We pride ourselves in the freedom of our press.
On that point, let's move on to our next question. Esme Edwards, please.
Was Chamberlain right to say that the British public know nothing of the Czechoslovak crisis?
Was Chamberlain right to say that the British public know nothing of the Czechoslovak crisis? That's obviously in reference to Chamberlain's wireless broadcast, where he said that the crisis was a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. Miss Grant-Duff, what do you think?
One of the reasons given by members of the government for their failure to offer support to the Czechs was that they could not carry the public opinion of the country with them. In the light of constant misrepresentations of the facts of the situation and the ambiguity of our government's foreign policy, it's hardly surprising that public opinion had scarcely yet grasped the vital importance of the issues at stake. It's probably true that the public didn't, maybe still don't, realise just how serious the situation really was. But this is only to be expected given the rose-tinted accounts the press preferred to give. It wasn't until the first week of September that public opinion began to stiffen, and the people of this country seemed finally ready to make a stand once and for all against the brutality of the Nazis.
The man smoking his pipe, please.
I've always been a keen follower of international news, and I've been expecting war to come to Britain for some time now. In fact, this time last month, when Chamberlain returned from Berchtesgaden, I was sure that war had finally arrived. I remember reading the Daily Express not long ago. It claimed that it was certain to avoid war this year and the next. I mean, I had to laugh at that. Miss Grant-Duff is absolutely right. The press has done a really terrible job at reporting on the Czechoslovak crisis. You'll be a fool to believe everything you read.
Fool. An interesting choice of words. Please, Mr. Madge?
Well, to come back to an earlier point, I'm not so sure that the British knew nothing, as the Prime Minister puts it, but I think the issue is that they weren't all that interested. Months before the recent meeting in Munich, we found that people were taking less and less interest in the news about the international situation. In many cases, they stopped reading newspapers and listening to the wireless news, and that if their friends said something about a crisis, they tried to change the subject. However, as soon as a significant decision was made in Munich, every big paper out there filled their pages with praise for Chamberlain. But then, in the course of just 1 week, no outsider reading an English newspaper would have guessed that an increasing proportion of the population would start feeling again more bewildered, fearful, and ashamed. It seems to me that there is a constant contrast between the published opinion and the public one, and that, in a nutshell, is why I have helped create Mass Observation, to obtain the public's true thoughts.
Thoroughly interesting, Mr. Madge. Lord Halifax, you're one of the Prime Minister's closest colleagues. Was Chamberlain right to say that the British public know nothing of the Czechoslovak crisis?
The Prime Minister was rightfully trying to calm the British people and assure them that there was no reason to panic. As we can see now, that was the correct course of action, as there is no crisis. To do otherwise would have caused undue stress to the population. As is the case with most government affairs, we do not inform the public of every detail. It would simply not be right to do so, but we do not withhold information that we feel they need to know.
The woman with the auburn hair, please.
But it's not about knowing all the details. I feel like I hardly know anything. When Chamberlain went to meet Hitler at Bad Godesberg, my family, friends and I were all listening in for any news and information about the development of negotiations. But all we got were 2 measly statements from Chamberlain, one before he left to fly to Germany, and one when he came back. No details about the meeting as it progressed, and no adequate explanation of events in Czechoslovakia. I was expecting a lot more information, but it never came. Anywhere I go, in the street, on the tube, the conversations that I hear don't represent those of a well-informed public. I, along with many others, don't feel particularly knowledgeable about the specific issues involved. What exactly are the issues between the Czechs and the Sudeten Germans? What is the government advising the Czech leaders to do? I just feel very vague about the whole affair. Perhaps if I knew more about it, I could form an opinion, but as it stands, I think the best thing to do is just to forget all about it.
The tall woman in the middle row, please.
Well, I am sorry, but I have to disagree. I actually feel extremely well informed. Not only has the Czechoslovak crisis been all over the newspapers recently, but it's discussed so frequently in the streets. I even overheard the milkman talking this morning. He believed that we can all say the worst has now indeed passed. Therefore, Mr. Chamberlain has quite possibly done it by going in an aeroplane to visit Hitler.
The milkman may have been correct. Would anybody like to respond? Yes. The man on the 3rd row in the black suit, please.
Well, in reading the Daily Mail, you think that the whole country stood behind Chamberlain's actions. Now look, I'm not thanking the Prime Minister for anything, and I know plenty of others who agree with me. I think it's an absolute disgrace that we live in a country where the newspapers trust the truth. No wonder the previous lady relies on her milkman as a source of news. Mr. Chamberlain patronised us when he said that we know nothing, but I well understand why he thinks that.
That is certainly an interesting view. Charles Madge, would you like to respond?
Well, I have to say I agree completely. In a study of ours, 1/3 of intelligent opinion was vague or undecided on the subject of the Czechs. 45% of an ordinary sample we took stated they were doubtful or disinterested, and it seems to me that such doubt is highest amongst the working class men and women.
So the British public are quite aware of the situation, but have not made up their minds. Would anybody like to respond to this? Yes, the young lady again, please.
I'm sorry, but it's highly unlikely for a member of the British public to know nothing about the crisis in Czechoslovakia, as information is everywhere. You cannot escape the news of the crisis. It almost seems that the government want to keep us informed with such events. In fact, I was recently at the cinema, and the newsreel shown there gave an equally sanitised presentation of events. The typically upbeat newsreel commentary presented Chamberlain as a noble politician on a mission for peace. I believe it was the British Gaumont newsreel that described Chamberlain as our great statesman who has brought to politics the common-sense point of view of the ordinary man in the street, and on whose same judgment we place our hopes of peace and happiness. And I thoroughly agree with this.
Lord Halifax, do you want to comment on that last point?
Yes, it is not our intention to leave the public in the dark. In fact, quite the opposite is true. It is our job to make sure the British people know about the issues that will affect them, and that is why, as the previous audience member pointed out, we provide so many newsreels. I can assure you that the newspapers are not exaggerating important events, or keeping anything significant from the public. If an issue is of significance to the public, then you can be sure they will be informed about it. And of course, the opinion of the British public is important to the government. We make policies that we feel best suit the needs and desires of our people, whilst also ensuring their safety.
Let's take one final comment from the audience, please. Yes, you, the woman with the stripy scarf, please.
You can hardly expect us to believe that. I think with a paper, there's always a man at the top who writes his point of view, so you get the news altered a bit to suit his ideas. The biased nature of newspapers means that the information that the public receives has been carefully selected and presented in such a way that reflects the political stance of the newspaper in question. I have for years believed that one of the main functions of the press is to lie, distort and suppress, so as to give a false picture of life and also to further the interests of the proprietors. I think we're only allowed to know in the news what the government wants us to know. The daily papers suffer from a depressing similarity with regard to news, which suggests to me that the government is keeping a firm grip on the information that's accessible to the public. Given this manipulation and censorship of the media, I think it's fair to say that we probably know relatively little about the crisis and its true implications for Czechoslovakia and indeed Europe. Well, at least if we choose to form our opinions solely on the stories we read in the papers and hear on the wireless.
I'm sorry, I know we're running out of time, but can I just say quickly that I couldn't agree more with you, madam. I think it's important to remember that people do show an awareness of some kind, despite the press's obsession to present everything in a positive light, and their claims that we're all united. If there's anything the Mass Observation Project has taught me so far in its young existence, it's that the people always know more than the newspapers imply.
Thank you all very much, but our time is up. Today we've heard some interesting views from our panellists and the public. Be sure to tune in next week, when we are in Stockwell, London, debating the merits of home bomb shelters and the air raid precautions. Good night from me.